Hi everyone, good evening. Welcome to CCA. My name is Nicola Prezzi, I'm the director here. Welcome to tonight's lecture with Dr. Daniel Milman. I will just briefly introduce our guest for tonight. It will be very short because I think Daniel himself will take us on a very interesting journey, so I will not say more. But I just want to say that Daniel, after studying finance, became truly fascinated with the psychoanalysis and with Freud, and really decided to kind of create this interesting new chapter in his life. And at the same time, he also developed a very deep love and passion for art. That's actually where the two of us met. Actually, the person who made us meet is here tonight, so I'm very happy about it. Esther Klaas is an artist, she's here with us. So I think all this will be included in the lecture tonight, and I want to thank Daniel for deciding to come and share his knowledge with us. I just want you to know what we have at CCA right now. Besides Daniel's lecture, we have two exhibitions. One by Karen Sitter, first institutional solo presentation of Karen Sitter in Israel. And we have a solo show by Noah Glaser. The first solo show is in an institution. So we are going to stay open after the lecture. So if you want to have a quick look or just please do. With no further introduction, I give the mic to Daniel and enjoy. Thank you.
So in traditional Lacanian psychoanalysis, the patient is put in a situation where he doesn't know how long the session is going to last. It is the psychoanalyst to decide. Since I am a Freudian, I'm going to tell you right away how long this is last. So this is going to last 45 minutes, so you know the dimensions of your pain. And after that, we will have 15 minutes for what I prefer to be a discussion rather than questions, because I'm not sure questions and answers exactly reflect what we're trying to achieve here. So in the first part, I will briefly try to discuss the question of am I a Freudian, because now that I told you that I am a Freudian, it starts the time to doubt if I am a Freudian, and this will be the occasion to trace a brief history of psychoanalysis. Better?
Yes.
Okay. After that, we will move on to looking at the work of three artists through my personal experience with them and how that reflects the evolution of contemporary psychoanalysis. So, let's start. Am I Freudian? A brief history of psychoanalysis. Frequently, I find myself embarrassed when asked if I am a Freudian. Surely, no one in his right mind, upon meeting an astrophysicist, would ask him if he is Newtonian. And yet, contemporary astrophysics, although based on Einstein's formulations, relies on the fundamental findings on gravity made by Isaac Newton. Science is a product of its time, and just as contemporary astrophysics cannot ignore Newton's discovery, contemporary psychoanalysis cannot ignore the Freudian discovery. Just what is the Freudian discovery? I propose that it is both the role of the unconscious and the importance of listening to the patient. The discovery of the role of the unconscious, as Freud famously said, is the third narcissistic wound inflicted by science to humanity. The first was the discovery by Copernicus that the Earth is not the center of the universe. The second is the Darwinian definition of evolution, resulting in the understanding that man wasn't created by God, but evolved from the great monkey. The third is the Freudian discovery that the ego is not the master in his own house because of the fundamental role of the unconscious. The listening to the patient results from Freud's acceptance to obey when the woman he was trying to cure told him to shut up and listen to her. The talking cure was born from the submission of a white male patriarch to the orders of a feminine patient. In a sense, Freud was a feminist, just like his illustrious patients Bertha von Pappenheim and Marie Bonaparte, or his dear friend Luan Salome. Freud enjoyed the company of intelligent and independent women much more than that of his male colleagues, whom he always suspected of betrayal or usurpation. Am I Freudian? Surely yes, since I firmly believe in what I just described as the two pillars of the Freudian discovery, the role of the unconscious and the importance of listening to the patient. However, just like the discovery of gravity by Newton, the Freudian discovery is a product of its time. Freud lived in the time of patriarchy in Vienna at the beginning of the 20th century. There and then, the rising role of the bourgeoisie made the quest for pleasure and the satisfaction of desires a key aspect of life, simply because what bourgeoisie means is the possibility of living a life allowing for something else than strict survival. But this freedom, this quest for pleasure, was strictly reserved to men. Sexual satisfaction could be found in brothels and cabarets, where fathers frequently took their sons to initiate them to the mysteries and pleasures of sex. Meanwhile, women from the bourgeoisie stayed at home, where the full weight of the proper functioning of the household lay squarely on their shoulders. Hysteria resulted from this historical situation, and although contrary to what is frequently thought, Freud insisted on the existence of male hysteria. This affection was endured by women simply because they were the main victims of their time. Men, when they dysfunctioned, were simply sent away to the clergy or the army, while women were forced to repress their desire. And this is an illustration of the consequence, which can be described as male hysteria. Freud invented a theoretical apparatus which reflected this situation and its psychopathological consequences. As a result, the role of the psychoanalyst was to help make the unconscious conscious, which meant helping the patient make room for unconscious death wishes against the father, the patriarch, and for the unconscious lust for the mother. In other words, the objective of analysis was to resolve the Oedipus complex. The function of the analyst in resolving the hysterical symptoms was through the interpretations of the slips, dreams, transferences, and free association to help the patient come to terms with what he was unsuccessfully trying to repress. Do I, as a contemporary psychoanalyst, still believe in the centrality of the Oedipus complex? Just as a contemporary astrophysicist recognizes the importance of gravity, I recognize the centrality of triangulation, father, mother, and child, in the formation of the human psyche. However, this centrality of triangulation was suddenly put in question by the eruption of Melanie Klein on the psychoanalytic scene, and her focusing on the early interactions between the newborn and his mother. In other words, the attention moved away from the Oedipus triangle to the mother-baby dyad. This shift was to be expected because since Freud's discovery consisted in looking at early childhood as the foundation of human psyche, it was only a matter of time before the attention was drawn to the early months of the child's life, which unfold in the presence of woman and the absence of man. Freud and Melanie Klein, however, shared the view that the human psyche emerges from the conflicts created by the demands of the drives. Freud was focusing on the Oedipian drives, love and hate, Klein on the baby's hostile and destructive drives towards the mother, aggressivity, hatred, and destructivity. Freud and Klein therefore shared the solipsistic view that the inner psychic reality was central. In the early days of his discovery, Freud had a moment of hesitation. Initially, he thought that at the origin of neurosis, there was a traumatic event, something tragic had happened in reality. He, however, decided to discard this view and theorize the traumatic nature of the human condition itself. Put differently, Freud considered that mankind suffered from its instincts because life in society necessarily led to their repression. Klein shared his view on the fundamental role of the unconscious and psychic reality. After the Second World War and its millions of refugees and victims, focusing on psychic reality, discarding reality and its traumatic effects became indefensible. The time for a fundamental shift in the understanding of the unfolding of the human psyche had arrived, and the central figure of this paradigmatic shift was to be Donald Winnicott. In the eyes of this genial pediatrician who during the course of his career consulted thousands of mothers and their children, there is no such a thing as a baby alone and immersed in its unconscious drive. As far as Winnicott was concerned, a baby exists only if there is a mother next to him. In other words, rather than the drives, Winnicott considered the interactions between the newborn and his mother as the fundamental factor in the emerging of the psyche. At the same time, patriarchy, because wartime led to prolonged period of absence of the fathers, while their wives successfully replaced them in the workforce, was slowly crumbling. Women had shown they were fully capable of undertaking masculine tasks in society. The right to vote enshrined this demonstration. The baby boom followed, along with a new priority given to the role of the mother and the moving away from the fascination with the Freudian unconscious drives. The role of the psychoanalyst shifted from that of the omnipotent oracle giving interpretations to that of the caring therapist attempting to heal the consequences of early trauma resulting from damaged baby-mother interaction. This led to the massive presence of women in the field of psychotherapy, which can still be observed nowadays. Pathologies were also evolving. Hysteria was becoming rare and replaced by what is described as the borderline condition. In this condition, the patient doesn't suffer from the consequences of Freudian repression or decline in splitting. Now the patient suffers from an incapacity to achieve representation within the psyche. He lacks the mental space to repress or deny, simply because there is no frame into which to deposit pain, and this lack echoes the absence, in one form or another, of the mother during the early moments of childhood. Therein lied the origin of the famous concept developed by Winnicott, the good enough mother. Before the 2 world wars, Freud was asked by a young mother, "How can I be a good mother?" He replied, "My dear lady, there is no such thing." Because he considered the Oedipal drives and their traumatic potential to be independent from the quality of the mother's attention. 50 years later, with the emerging of feminism and the crumbling of patriarchy, Winnicott was confronted with the same question. His answer was that there is no such thing as a good mother. What is necessary is a good enough mother. A good enough mother, in his view, is a mother who manages to help the child negotiate the dialectic between the demands of his instincts and the limitations and frustrations resulting from the outside world. The role of the father becomes apparently marginal, and this paved the way to the apparition of the so-called new fathers, who basically were men imitating women. However, the role of the father is fundamental and consists in 2 central functions. The first is to shield the child from the forces of destiny. The second is to make him discover ambivalence. A father appears on the symbolic scene of the child's psyche as being both the object of love and hatred. Love as the result of the shelter he provides, and hatred in that he impersonates an obstacle for the baby's love of his tender mother. Both shelter and ambivalence are essential conditions for the unfolding of a human psyche. The necessity for a sense of safety is obvious. The importance of ambivalence no less, for it is the way we naturally react to any object presented to us, be it from within or without. Like, for example, right now, do you like me or not? French contemporary psychoanalysts, aware of the danger of total replacement of the father by the so-called new fathers, criticized the paradigmatic and all-encompassing mother-baby dyad, and called for the reinstating of the triangle as a necessary element of the building of the representational space. Ever the romantics, they offered the idea that a good enough mother is a woman breastfeeding her baby, helping him to negotiate the emerging perception of reality, but doing so while fantasizing about her man, the father of the baby. I believe that this reinstating of the role of triangulation, even during the first days and weeks of the life of the baby, is not only fundamental but also very natural. During the years following the death of Winnicott and until the present, many important new perspectives and refinements have emerged in psychoanalysis, reflecting the acceleration of changes in the contemporary world. Contemporary psychoanalysis is attempting to take into account new findings, such as the fascinating progresses in neurosciences, as well as the effect of contemporary societal issues, profoundly modifying the definition of the family, such as the apparition of foster mothers, adoption by gay couples, in vitro fertilization, so-called fatherless conception, etc. Contemporary psychoanalysis is in the never-ending process of being reformulated, and just like the astrophysics or any other science, it is built on the sum of all the preceding knowledge, as well as by the efforts to take into account the rapid changes in mankind's understanding of its environment and itself. To go back to the initial question posed at the beginning of this presentation, am I Freudian? The answer probably should be yes, also, obviously, but not only. I would like now, it is the object of my presentation, to try to give you an idea of this contemporary psychoanalysis I've been referring to. And to do so, I will refer to three concepts: the place of language, the role of the secret, and the understanding of the dream. I will do so by showing how these three aspects are used in therapy, and rather than referring to clinical examples as is classically done, I will illustrate these three concepts by trying to show how this new approach can also change our relation to art. To do so, I will refer to my personal encounters with the works of three artists, Alberto Giacometti, Cy Twombly, and Louise Bowen. So, the place of language, wordless encounters with art, Alberto Giacometti. In 1901, Freud found himself for the first time in front of the magnificent Moses sculpted by Michelangelo from 1512 to 1516. He was looking at it, having read about its creator, its patron, the Pope, and its subject, Moses. Freud went back to see the sculpture many times, including during his 3-week stay in Rome in 1913, when he looked at it every day, studying it, measuring it, drawing it. Like this. Freud had also spent many hours meditating on the figure of Moses, leader of the Hebrew people, about whom he was to write his final book, Moses and Monotheism, which was published in 1939, shortly after his death. Acting as if he was the analyst of the sculptor, whose work he approached was a dream produced by a patient, Freud made a psychoanalytical interpretation reflecting the model I described earlier. In other words, the patient, here Michelangelo, has a dream, which is the sculpture, and the wise psychoanalyst delivers his interpretation. Freud's interpretation is that the discrete, Freud's interpretation is that the discrete movement of the hand holding the beard betrays the decision made by this 16th century Moses not to break the tables of the law, to hold back his violent reaction at the sight of the decadent behavior of his unfaithful people, lost in the adoration of the golden calf. The wise, non-violent Moses, sculpted by Michelangelo, represents, Freud believed, and identifies with, the genius of civilization controlling its aggressive urges in the name of good leadership by virtue of example. However, Freud's interpretation reflects the sum of knowledge he had accumulated both about Michelangelo and Moses. By analyzing the meaning of the sculpture, Freud was losing contact with the initial shock he experienced when he saw it for the first time. In 1973, I was age 15. My parents decided to visit Saint-Paul-de-Vence in the south of France. This little village, perched on a provincial hill, had made constant efforts in protecting its houses and streets which date back to the Middle Age. This, along with the beautiful provincial light, its sunny climate nurturing olive trees and vineyards, led many artists to visit and for some of them to live there. Chief among them was Marc Chagall, who is buried in the cemetery of Saint-Paul-de-Vence. Other artists such as Fernand Léger, Pablo Picasso, Calder, Miro were often seen walking the streets of the village. In the center of Saint-Paul, there's a beautiful hotel called La Colombe d'Or, where Yves Montand celebrated his wedding to Simone Signoret in the 1960s. The owner of the hotel, Monsieur Paul Roux, as well as his son, had the genius to understand that accepting to be paid with paintings by the visiting artist was a good idea. Slowly, the walls of the Colombe d'Or became covered with masterpieces. The reputation of Saint-Paul-de-Vence, now fed by the world of cinema as well as that of the arts, grew, and when Adrien Mag, the celebrated Parisian art dealer of Alberto Giacometti, decided to create a foundation, he chose a vast terrain close to the famous village. Inaugurated during the 60s in the presence of André Malraux, the genial and first French Minister of Culture, the foundation was installed in an ambitious and radical building which celebrated the work of Alberto Giacometti and Miro. So, age 15 and equipped with a photo camera my father had offered me to encourage my recent passion for photography, I arrived at the foundation. Contrary to Freud in front of Michelangelo's Moses, I was totally ignorant of the work and even of the name of Giacometti. I entered the enclosed courtyard, and there, before my amazed eyes and my camera objective, I discovered L'Homme qui marche, the now famous sculpture which sold in 2015 for more than $140 million to Lili Safra. This, however, this sale only happened 40 years after my innocent visit. In 1973, the sculpture was standing alone for me to admire. I raised my camera and stopped breathing to achieve a stable framing of what I was seeing, but also to contain my emotions. There were no words to express the awe I felt in the presence of Giacometti's work. There, before me, was truth itself. Mankind at its weakest and its strongest, moving on towards its destiny, stripped naked but determined, almost no flesh and yet walking. What I'm trying to convey to you is the wordless, uninformed admiration that enraptured me. In psychoanalytic terms, I had regressed to a pre-Oedipal condition of direct, almost skin-to-skin condition, like a baby clinging to his mother. I was allowing, without knowing it, the sculpture to think me. I was its creator, it owned me, fed me, protected me with not a single word being uttered. It was its presence in itself which was holding me in its arms. It reassured me and it frightened me. It was towering over me, and to quote Jacques Brel, I had become the shadow of its shadow, both sheltered and fully dependent. Thankfully, I managed to press the shutter button on the camera, and the sound of the inner mirror clacking to let the light in and impress the negative freed me from the sculpture's spell. Still under the shock, I walked away, now impatient to see the photo I had just taken, which in those days would take time to get developed. Ah, the pleasure of waiting, where has it now gone? What had just happened to me has now become a central aspect of contemporary psychoanalysis. One of the masters of modern technique, Wilfred Bion, gave a clear instructions to present therapists. Come to the session with no desire and no memory. In other words, no memory of what you have learned, no memory of what the patient has previously told you, and no desire to cure him or any vision of the future of the treatment. The therapist should enter the scene of the session in the condition which resembles my state of ignorance when I entered the courtyard of the Mac Foundation. It is a fundamentally wordless condition, one which allows for a state of reverie to unfold and leads to a pre-verbal communication between an analyst and his patient. By allowing this progression to occur, infantile, wordless experiences can be brought back to consciousness and shared. Surely, in my case, the analyst was the sculptor and I was the patient. However, I was not thrown into the wordless bliss of the dyad, uniquely composed of me and the sculpture. Alberto Giacometti, the artist, was also, if only symbolically, present. Similarly, the mother breastfeeding her baby should fantasize about the child's father, and the analyst should work in the symbolical presence of his own analyst. The scene is therefore pre-verbal and Oedipian. It is triangulated. Such is the first way of looking at art in the present, can be informed by contemporary analysis. Read as much as you want about the art you're about to see, but approach this art as a beginner. Forget everything you know. Abandon any expectation. Open yourself to pre-verbal impressions, and remember that even in the deepest state of admiration of a work of art, you are not alone with it, for the ghost of the author, the artist, is observing you. Now we move to the following part, the role of the secret, keeping one's impressions to oneself, sight only. In the very early days of psychoanalysis, Freud, when confronted to patients momentarily unable to freely associate, gave them a small slap of the hand on the forehead, instructing them to immediately say what came to their mind, no matter how strange or embarrassing it seemed. The fundamental rule of psychoanalysis, the instructing the patient to freely associate and say everything that came to his mind, emerged from this approach. Free associations aim to make the unconscious conscious and give more space to the suffering ego, caught between the demands of the human drives and the laws of society. But what if the origin of the psychic suffering lies in the pre-verbal early years of the patient? What if this suffering has resulted in wordless pain due to insufficient care, abandonment, or intrusion? What if at the moment the trauma occurred, the child did not possess the words to describe the events, such as a rape, incest, or abuse? Put differently, what if the only way the patient can share his memory of trauma is not through words, but through actually sharing with the analyst the emotion of the trauma? The work of the analyst will then consist in putting into words what the patient experiences but cannot verbalize. However, sharing emotions requires trust, and building trust takes time. During the necessary time for the therapeutic alliance to be built, the patient will have a secret, and contemporary analysis has opted for allowing the patient to keep his secret no matter how long it takes. In 2003, age 45, I found myself for 2 days in Zurich. I decided to visit the museum and especially its impressive collection of Giacometti sculptures. The sculptures had been taken to a new space. Now they were installed in a big longitudinal room in which they formed a sort of procession. Startled by this, I walked among the sculptures as if I was discovering them again. At the other end of the room, I was surprised to see a door slightly ajar. I wondered where it could lead. I opened the door and found myself staring at a large room in which stood 10 sculptures. I was mesmerized. Before me was what I thought impossible. Sculptures made after the death of Giacometti, and which I instantly felt were beautiful enough to emerge from the long shadow of the Swiss master. Here was a group of fragile and poetic works made of various found objects, delicately assembled and painted in white, forming an elegiac and elegant ensemble. Afraid to break the spell of this magnificent surprise, I read the name of the artist, Psychoanalysis. Who was he? I had never heard of him. After my visit to the Zurich Museum, I started to inquire and was often mocked. You don't know Twombly? He's a towering genius of painting. Soon I was frenetically buying books about Twombly. Born in America, a personal and close friend of Rauschenberg, with whom at the dawn of their careers he had traveled to Morocco, Twombly had decided to leave New York and its bustling art scene to go live in Rome. To him, the proximity of the Mediterranean and of the antique world were as necessary to his creation as the air he breathed. Bear in mind that this was happening in 1957. No important post-war artist lived in Rome at the time, and yet here was Twombly, living in a palazzo, surrounded by a growing collection of Roman busts. He was reading, among many others, Stéphane Mallarmé, Rainer Maria Rilke, John Keats, and Virgil. Quotes from the writings of these giants of literature and poetry were appearing in his paintings in the forms of graffitis and freely scribbled handwriting in the midst of richly and apparently haphazardly colored shapes and traces. The result was deeply moving and enrapturing. The sculptures of Twombly, such as the ones I had seen in Zurich, were less well known, and he had the reputation of rarely casting them while holding on to the originals. As a result, very few were in circulation. Even lesser known than his sculptures were his photographs. And yet, ever since the 50s, Twombly had developed a technique which was to become his signature. Based on Polaroids developed, enlarged, and printed in a special and ancient way, it formed a unique ensemble documenting the artist's vision of the objects and places which had drawn his attention. It was as if Proust had taken photos, illustrating his famous descriptions of people and places. The closeness to the French author was celebrated in a wonderful exhibition of Twombly's photos at the Fondation Lambert in Avignon. Twombly himself curated it in June 2011. Its title was Le Temps Retrouvé, Time Found Again, the title of the last volume of Proust's masterpiece. It was the last time Twombly curated a show. 8 years earlier, in 2003, while visiting the art library of the Musée du Jeu de Paume in Paris, I had found, hidden among books celebrating the works of important photographers such as Cartier-Bresson or Saul Leiter, a beautiful book reproducing some of the photos of Cy Twombly. Having bought it, I went back home, where I feverishly leafed through the pages, discovering beautiful and moving photos. Some showed paintings in progress, others fragments of sculptures, others close-up of flowers, and yet others views of the Bay of Naples and its surrounding. I had the impression of discovering photos taken by Proust himself, the fragility, the precision, the capturing a fleeting moment. It was all there. I started fantasizing about Dice was made. A group of 3 photos showing peonies lying in what appeared to be a Roman cup had attracted my attention, and on the following page what appeared to be a fragment of a sculpture. My idea was to create an ensemble of 3 photos, 2 of the peonies on the antique cup and that of the sculpture fragment. I called a gallery representing Twombly and expressed my wish to buy these 3 photos. A month passed before the gallery got back in touch. Twombly was only willing to let me buy the 3 peonies photos because they constituted a group which could not be modified. Slightly annoyed because I was proud of my choice, and also because I felt very few people paid attention to the photo of Twombly, I nevertheless accepted and bought the 3 photos which duly arrived in Paris. About a month later, the gallery informed me of a very rare event. Twombly, who almost never made presents of his works, had decided, without having ever met me, to give me the photo of the sculpture fragment. In 2016, 5 years after Twombly's death, I was allowed to see his resting place. A special authorization of the Vatican had made the burying of Twombly's remains inside a beautiful and melancholic church in Rome possible. Looking at the plaque inscribed with his name, I thought back to the photograph Twombly had offered me, and with which he had clearly expressed a form of approval of my choice. I found myself to be deeply moved by his gesture, which acknowledged my understanding of his work. I looked at the plaque with a sense of an irreparable loss, but also of a very unique experience. I have never until now publicly told this story. It was a secret, the meaning of which I had never articulated even to myself. Last year, looking at the Mediterranean, I remembered a phrase by Fernand Braudel, the great historian. The best witness to the Mediterranean's age-old past is the sea itself. A moment's concentration or daydreaming, and that past comes back to life. Later that year, staring at the sea, I felt its potential to bring back to the present a moment from the past. Twombly's work now was part of that vast past and profound movement, which can be felt by anyone who has a few minutes to contemplate the Mediterranean. It is only fair that it does, since Twombly's art was born on the shores of this sea. Roland Barthes, who wrote a very famous text about Twombly's work, described it as an art with a secret. So what is the secret? It took the writing of this text for me to acknowledge it. Without ever having met him, I had fallen in love with Twombly, and I believe this falling in love is what unites the aficionados of his art. For it is not only his art which moves us, it is the man making it. I think the only precedent in the history of art is Rembrandt and his series of self-portraits, faithfully documenting the successive visions he had of himself. Twombly's works, his paintings, his sculptures, and especially his photos, form an uncompromising and romantic archive of himself as seen through his own eyes. Just like Marcel Proust and his In Search of Lost Time, which famously ends with the volume entitled Finding Time Again, Twombly's photos allow us to retrieve his past as if it was ours. We find ourselves looking at a fragment of his life as if they were ours, and this is a testimony to the rigorous approach he had of himself and his environment. In turn, these fragments can become ours, just as the famous little piece of yellow painted wall described by Proust can become a memory of our own childhood. I fell in love with Twombly because through his work he gave me the past I always wanted, needed, and lacked. This is the secret it took me years to nurture before confessing. Contemporary psychoanalysis is now involved in a direction where the respect for the patient's secret has become central. However, our brave new world has thrown us in the arms of social media. No sooner have people seen a work of art than a selfie appears on Instagram, picturing the spectator at the forefront and the art in the background. We all feel compelled to instantly communicate whatever art exhibitions trigger in us. We have the impression of being expected to feed the deafening brouhaha of art conversations as numerous as they are superficial. Good art, in my view, is haunted by the presence of its creator. To see it properly, we must approach it in silence, as if walking in a forest, hoping to catch the glimpse of a deer. The same can be said of the impression good art makes on us. It is a fragile and mutating trace, which must be fed by time and sheltered from premature chatter. This, therefore, is the second contribution contemporary psychoanalysis can make to a new way of looking at art. Keep the effect art has on us a secret. Nurture it within ourselves. Feed it with our afterthoughts and our readings. And finally, in time, talk about it to people we trust. Next slide. A new understanding of the dream. The dream has many dreamers. Louise Lohr. The most famous dream in the history of psychoanalysis is certainly the one told in 1912 by Sergei Pankeyev, better known as the Wolfman. The dream which Pankeyev recalled in analysis occurred when he was 5 years old. In it, he saw himself in bed when suddenly the window of his room opened, and on the branches of a large tree in the garden, he sees 6 or 7 impassive white wolves. Pankeyev recalls that he woke up screaming and that it took his nanny a few minutes to calm him down, so frightened he was of the impassible wolves. Freud's interpretation of the dream was that Pankeyev, aged 18 months, had witnessed from his cradle an incomprehensible and traumatizing scene. His parents making love a tergo, which means he saw the father making love to his mother from behind. Freud arrived at that striking interpretation by taking into account numerous elements from the Wolfman's complicated childhood and family history. However, in the 1970s, Pankeyev was interviewed in Vienna by a journalist called Karin Obholzer, and she reported that he considered Freud's interpretation as terribly far-fetched. We are here again in the presence of the early model of psychoanalysis, in which the patient was expected to submit to the analyst's interpretation. Freud's interpretation has not failed to draw criticism from later generations of psychoanalysts, beginning with Otto Rank in 1926, all the way to contemporary analysts who have drawn attention to other very important elements of the childhood of Pankeyev, such as the likely schizophrenia and untimely death of his sister, the suicide at age 49 of his depressed father, and the role of successive nannies entrusted with the caring of the boy. Further historic research even led to the discovery of a fantastic scene which occurred in the early childhood of the patient when he saw his probably hysterical mother back from a night ride on a snow sledge, dancing naked, surrounded by wolf furs in front of the large fireplace of the family's estate. This scene might also have played a role in the formation of the wolf dream. What matters here is that there are many possible interpretations of the dream. The fact that Freud possessed a true genius in interpreting dreams is a testimony of his extraordinary creative capacity and of the quality of his insight. However, the patient did not see this interpretation as meaningful. In contemporary psychoanalysis, the approach of the interpretation of dreams has radically changed. Analysts now consider a dream to be a product of the analysis itself. Clearly, it is dreamt by the dreamer, but it is also the result of the ongoing therapy, and therefore can be understood as having 3 authors: the patient, the therapist, and the process itself. The wolf's dream would now be approached from a triple perspective. The analyst would ask himself the following questions. Beyond the childhood events recalled by the patient, what is presently happening in the life of the patient? Which reaction has the patient's therapy triggered in the analyst's mind? And finally, at what stage is the therapy itself? The interpretation of the dream would be the result of a dialogue between patient and analyst trying together to take into account the various factors we have just described. It would be an understanding of the dream as seen by its authors. In literature, the author Luigi Pirandello had the intuition that such a process was possible. One of his plays entitled 7 Characters in Search of an Author. Contemporary psychoanalysis considers a dream to also be in search of its authors. A few years ago, my attention was drawn by the work of a photographer called Louise Lohr. The process of her early work consists in taking photos of works of art in their surroundings, such as collector homes or museums. I immediately felt drawn to her approach because it was stating the importance of a work of art's environment, but also the way it is framed by the photographer. Louise Lohr is therefore claiming the importance of the spectator's perspective, which also creates a work of art by installing the piece he is looking at in his mind's eye. Her work shows that looking at art creates an art form with 3 authors: the artist, the person who installs the piece and the spectator. As you recall, my first contact with art occurred through the discovery of Giacometti's sculpture as seen through my camera. To find myself in the presence of an artist who is elevating this very process to the status of an art form was a precious moment. I got in touch with the gallery representing Louise Goller and inquired about available works. There were a few classical pieces showing works of Mondrian or Warhol photographed in the homes of their owners. One piece, however, drew my attention. It was a photo of a circular mirror painted by Roy Lichtenstein, hung at the Museum of Modern Art against the background of a black wall. It looked like the moon in a black sky. It was striking because, contrary to her classical work, nothing from the environment of the Lichtenstein mirror could be recognized. It was pitch black, no fragment of the window, detail of the bed, or any of the frequent objects in Loller's photos was visible. Struck by this work's radical aspect, I decided to buy it. I lived with it a few years, but probably because of its minimalism and also my personal circumstances at the time, it started to weigh on me. In a sense, we were both lonely and not very successful at keeping each other company. We were like a dreamer and his dream failing at relating to each other. Louise Loller, having recently been given a very important retrospective at MoMA, I decided to take advantage of a strong market and to sell it at auction. I shipped it to London. Meanwhile, a person with a deep understanding of photography entered my life. We found ourselves in long and fascinating conversations about this medium. Our discussions would frequently last late into the night. One such night, there was a very full and luminous moon, which profoundly impressed us. Struck by the vision of the moon, I mentioned the piece by Louise Loller and the fact I was planning to sell it. My friend was horrified. How can you sell a fantastic piece by such an important artist? I felt as if I was waking up from a very deep sleep. Suddenly, the photo by Louise Loller had acquired a meaning I could understand. By revealing the profound link between the moon and the mirror, both objects reflecting light, it had become an illustration of the profound mystery triggered by the vision of the human face, as described by Emmanuel Levinas. What Loller's photo was showing was the face of the moon represented by a mirror. In other words, it is what is classically called a mise en abîme, which is an infinite set of reflections. I believe that to be in the presence of another person's face is to look at infinite reflections resulting from multiple identifications and reminiscence. The next morning I called the London auction house. Could I cancel the sale and have my piece sent back to Tel Aviv? Thankfully the answer was positive. The beautiful moonlight photo by Louise Loller is now safely back and installed in its rightful place. This work of art was like a dream in search of its author. It needed to be given its interpretation, and for that to happen, two elements were needed: a setting and an interpreter. The arrival of this person in my life and our nighttime conversations were just that. Louise Loller's piece had now been given its meaning. It was safe from the market to which it was catastrophically destined. In order for this to happen, just like a dream awaiting its interpretation, the work of art needed to be created, seen, and later understood. An important and unexpected aspect of this story is the role played by time, because the acquisition of the art piece preceded its meaning by a few years. The French psychoanalyst Pontalis wrote that dreaming is above all the attempt to maintain an impossible union with the mother, to preserve an undivided whole, to move in a space prior to time. Sometimes, work of art can function in our lives the ways dreams do. They will resuscitate a lost past. They will point to a future for which we are longing, and they will abolish the tyranny of time. For this to happen, the multiple authors of the work of art's interpretation must be given their rightful place. This is the third way contemporary psychoanalysis can inform a new way of looking at art. Art should be considered just like dreams. They are creations awaiting their authors in order to be given their meaning. Spectators should take in what they see, let it mature and evolve within themselves. They should abandon the logic of time and allow for apparently illogical developments to occur, such as loving a work of art and finding the reason for that love much later. I conclude with the concept of the aesthetic conflict and the private enigma of art. Contemporary psychoanalysis has shown us three new ways to approach art. The first is that we should approach it as beginners. The second is to keep the effect a work of art has on us until there emerge a desire and a possibility to share this experience. The third is to recognize the three authors of an artwork: the artist, the curator, and the spectator. Donald Meltzer is one of the most important figures of contemporary psychoanalysis. His work with autistic children led him to remarkable insights concerning the early mother-baby interactions. One of these insights is the concept of aesthetic conflict. According to Meltzer, the aesthetic conflict results from the simultaneous discovery by the baby of the mother's beauty and mystery. As the baby is breastfed, he discovers the beauty of his mother, while at the same time he experiences the enigma of her mood, which can unexpectedly change for no understandable reason. According to Meltzer, the impact of this enigma is such that the baby retreats to what Melanie Klein described as the paranoid schizoid position characterized by fear and aggressivity. It is possible that looking at art, we also experience the aesthetic conflict described by Meltzer, and we try unconsciously to escape from it because we are faced with the return of a very archaic episode made of beauty and mystery, one that unfolds at a time when we're lacking words to understand it. It occurred to me that the deeply buried memory of being breastfed is also such a moment, and I believe contemporary psychoanalysis shows us that there are clear parallels between the early mother-child interaction and the experience of looking at art. The breastfeeding situation, including the fantasies of the mother and the absence of language of the baby, is a wordless encounter. Looking at art should be a silent event. The very intimate personal experience of being breastfed and of breastfeeding are deeply sheltered in memory. The effect of looking at art should also be kept private and intimate. Lastly, the breastfeeding situation, just like the new understanding of dreams, implies three characters: the baby, the mother, the father. The spectator looking at art should also recognize the three authors of the scene: the artist, the curator, and himself. To conclude, I suggest we should treat our encounters with works of art as if they were fragile memories from the early days of our childhood. Memories so distant that they date from a period where there was no language and the scansion of time was not yet perceived. A time placed under the reign of beauty and mystery. Thank you. Just to remind you that the first image when I started talking is this very famous painting by Giorgione called The Tempest, about which many, many pages have been written trying to solve its mystery. I find it interesting that it represents exactly what I'm describing. So maybe this is the mystery, a mystery that should stay a mystery. Okay. Call for question.
Any question from the audience?
Want my phone number?
You suggest one should innocently approach the art. It's very difficult when you have
Can
experience.
you speak in there? No? Okay.
But I hear the question. You're saying that I'm saying that one should approach the art innocently, but it is very difficult when one has experience.
Yeah.
This is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Well,
How
to
do
forget.
we set ourselves back into this situation where we are like newborn?
Yes, it is not easy, but it is recommended, as I said, by Wilfred Lyon, as a strategy for the therapist. So it means that the therapist, when the patient arrives, has to make this effort to lose memory, to lose desire, to find himself like this blank space, if you want. So I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying it's important.
So one needs psychoanalysis to look, to start to look at art again.
No.
To set back.
No. It's simply a discipline to try to re-establish contact with the beginner in us.
Thank you.
I'm not trying to sell psychoanalysis here. Just on the contrary, I'm trying to give you things, without having to pay for sessions.
More questions? Can I give you the microphone? It's okay?
Sure.
Good. Thank you.
I just thought that your explanation of how you fell in love with Cy Twombly was wonderful, because so many people fall in love with art and they don't understand it, but they don't need to understand it because they're in love with it, and they feel like they have to know something, but it's the falling in love with it that's appreciating it. So, and actually, you helped me appreciate Cy Twombly more. So thank you.
No comment.
Hi. I'm curious if you feel like the principles that you suggested for appreciating visual art are applicable also to, say, literature or music, if you feel like there's a fundamental difference between appreciating those different mediums.
No. In fact, I think it's the same. It just happens that this isn't my life. But the idea of being beginners was first proposed by Rilke, and is defending the approach of art as beginners was for any form of art. So it is not strictly to visual art.
Serge, I will try to reach you. I don't know if I can. Maybe you come towards us.
Thank you, Daniel. Just a quick question on what I perceive to be a little bit of a conflict in the desire to come clean or unaffected to an artwork and be impressed by the presence of the artwork itself. And on the counter of that, your story about Cy Twombly and understanding the artist rather than the piece. There's an inherent conflict in that, in those two conceptions.
I'm not sure I see the conflict.
Well, if you come with knowledge to an artwork, knowing the artist, that's one experience, right? So you're impressed by the person.
I understand.
You understand?
What I was referring to in the case of Twombly is the importance of the secret.
Sorry.
What I was referring to in the case of Twombly is the importance of the secret. Not the importance of the not knowing anything. This was in the case of Psychoanalysis. In the case of Twombly, what I was saying is that something happened which took me a long time to realize. And protecting this time, allowing it to unfold, I think is very important. In the world where we are asked, as the minute you walk out of an exhibition or a movie or whatever, what do you think? You have to answer questions. I think this goes contrary to the effect art has on us. But I see what you're saying. These two approaches can result in a conflict.
Thank you so much for coming. We have the shows on and we have some cool water, so you can stay and wander around. Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you very much.